All right, so if you're here, hopefully today you're here to learn about testing your Vue app. And so given the brief intro that we had earlier, my name is Ben Hong. You can find me on all of the Internet of Things, whether it's GitHub, Twitter, you name it, it'll be under Ben Codezen. And so I realized as far as the 3 hashtags, I decided to update my slides a little bit because I came up with some better ones. One of them is fun fact about me is I love amusement parks. So if you can't find me, I'm the guy up here. So this is one of those Jurassic Fall attractive park water rides where you just, fall down this huge waterfall. So love them, just going on rides. So those are a lot of fun. But for those wondering, this was taken in 2017. So as you know, the quarantine situation in the US, not the greatest. So yes, we are still socially distancing and being responsible. And then as far as my other hashtag, in case anyone's been playing, sorry, I mentioned, totally recommend playing Fall Guys. It's a really great, basically 60-person fun game. Even for non-gamers, it's a lot of fun to play with friends. So those are my 2 better hashtags than what I came up with earlier. All right, so a little bit more about me. I'm currently a DX engineer at Cypress. And so as I mentioned before, I'm on the Vue core team working primarily on the docs. And I also teach at Vue Mastery, which is an online platform to teach Vue courses. Okay. So the very first disclaimer I have, sorry, the Zoom tools are getting in my way. Give me a sec. All right, there we go. All right, very first thing. So I don't have a computer science degree. And prior to sort of like, I guess the past year, I really had difficulty when it came to testing, especially on the front end side of things, because as we'll talk a bit more about that. So just know that, for those who are like, gosh, I haven't done much testing, or we're gonna sort of level set so everyone's on the same playing field and go from there. All right, so when most people talk about testing, there's this pyramid that everyone talks about, and the 3 basic ones are unit testing, integration testing, and end-to-end testing, often shortened to E2E. At a basic level, when it comes to testing your Vue app, most people talk about, unit testing. And so what does that typically entail? And so here we have our proverbial sum function that simply takes an A and B parameter and returns, A plus B. And then the test goes, hey, if you call sum with 1 and 2, we expect it to be 3. And this is like the proverbial example everyone provides for like why and how unit tests should be done. But one of the challenges I found with unit tests is that a lot of times when it comes to front-end stuff, it's not always so simple. Like we're not just simply testing functionality. We want to do more like sort of high-level things. And so you might be wondering like, okay, so how do if I wanted to do unit testing inside of my Vue app, what should I use? And so at a high level, basically the recommended library to use is basically Jest, and that's fairly consistent across most of the frameworks actually. Mocha is another one that's fairly popular. But when it comes to testing your Vue app, I found that, again, to what I was saying earlier about front-end development, like unit tests help to a degree, but again, I find that the impact is not quite what I'm looking for. So let's cover the rest of the pyramid and then go from there. So some of you might also be wondering like, whoa, go back. All right, some of you might have heard about Vue Test Utils, which is an officially supported Vue testing library. And you're like, well, wait, why didn't you mention about that? And so recently, we've updated the testing guide to basically mention that the Vue Test Utils, while officially supported, is really about exposing low-level APIs for testing. And so as a result, when it comes to testing your units, or for some people, they call it component testing, then you might want to check out Kelsey Dodd's testing library. This is actually the recommended library that the testing team wants to at least push people towards. It still utilizes Vue testing utils under the hood, so don't worry, it's not that the 2 are divorced in any way. But in terms of if you're looking for component testing right now, testing library is the way to go. Okay. So we talked about unit. Let's talk a little bit about integration tests. So integration tests at a high level is basically about taking the individual pieces of your application, whether it's your APIs, your database, and just checking to make sure like, does everything kind of fit together, right? Like if I make a call, does it fail? How do the pieces kind of go together? And so this part, the definition also is hotly debated amongst people who, so in the testing realm, because there are different layers of integration that can happen. And so when it comes to measuring the success of integration tests and unit tests, you'll hear oftentimes in testing, we talk about code coverage. And so for those who haven't seen it before, this is an example of like a code coverage report, where you can see that it actually basically analyzes your code in your app and basically lets you know how many tests have you written for it and how much coverage. We can see that, we have the files listed out. It actually counts how many statements. It checks the branch, what functions. So you can see here. Let's see. Yep. And then on top of that, it'll even like go into like what specific lines were covered. And so it's very, very thorough. And so a lot of times as developers, we use this sort of as our metric for like, oh, like, are we doing a good job testing? And given a lot of us tend to be, sort of completionists and we like to get things to everything green, like we feel pretty confident when we have like a testing report that looks like this. We're like, oh, this is good. Like our app is covered quite well. And so the thing about this is that, again, we're covered a high level definition of unit and integration testing. But what I'm here to propose is that while these tools are great, I think we've actually forgotten the most critical metric that often determines whether or not we are successful as developers. And that is ultimately the user. And so we've talked about the first two stages. Again, this is where most people's they recommend you start testing is from unit, then integration. And so end-to-end test then is where we're talking about how does everything really work together. And so it answers that one question of like, at the end of the day, does everything work, right? The API might successfully call the database, but if the application cannot successfully call the API, like as far as we're concerned, it doesn't work. Because what we really care about when it comes to testing is making sure that when it comes to our user, that whether they tap on something, they're trying to add someone to their profile or paying for something or messaging someone, we want to make sure that the user's experience actually works. Because beyond that, those are where the real bugs is, and not necessarily in our individual, functions that we're testing at a unit level. Now, some of you who do have some end-to-end testing experience or have heard about end-to-end tests know that a lot of times developers, it's kind of a painful topic. No one really wants to talk about it, and there are a couple of reasons for this. Traditionally, when it comes to end-to-end tests, they often take a long time to run. And when I say a long time to run, I'm talking about like at least 30 minutes to like 2 hours. Some even take longer. And so you can imagine when it comes to reviewing pull requests and those sort of things, like if you have to wait for an end-to-end test to run the build, like the iteration cycles that you get on your development team just like reduce drastically, let alone like the context switching and everything that comes with it. On top of that, there's also this term that's often mentioned in end-to-end tests called like the tests are flaky. In other words, they're unreliable because sometimes the end-to-end test will fail randomly for a particular reason, for no particular reason. And so you might think, oh, there's like a bug in my test or a bug in my application. Turns out it was a false negative. And over time, this basically results in teams basically not trusting their tests, which is, that's the whole point of them. So if you're starting to run deployments, even though you know that your tests are failing, your tests have basically lost their value. More importantly, when we talk about end-to-end tests, typically what's often talked about hand in hand is cross-browser testing too. So making sure you cover Chrome, Mozilla, Safari, Internet Explorer, Opera, like cover all of them because again, we typically want to try to cover everything at once. And then on top of that, let's not forget, we have to deal with all these devices too. So does it work on desktop? What does it look like on mobile? How about tablet? What about widescreens? And then when you combine that with, as I mentioned earlier, like the fact that you have flaky tests and things are failing, like, oh gosh, end-to-end tests are just a scary thing that just like, it's no wonder why no one wants to deal with it because it just consumes so much time. And, most people just ended up choosing to make the trade-off not to even bother with this. Now, some of us might feel a little stressed out, so we're gonna take a deep breath together and just inhale and exhale. All right, so I'm here to not give you, as much as this may seem like bad news as far as how legacy development has happened, I think when it comes to testing your Vue application, there is a way forward. And so I think to start with, I want to introduce the Pareto principle to everyone. And for those who haven't heard of it before, you might have also heard it also called the 80-20 rule. And I think this is particularly useful when it comes to thinking about testing your application. For those who don't know what the 80-20 rule is, it basically boils down to the idea that for 20% of the effort, you end up with 80% of the results. So this is often said in like a sales sort of context where, 20% of your clients is 80% of your revenue, because they're often like either really large clients and those sort of things. And so this Pareto principle is really important because this really tells us where our biggest impact is. Because while it might feel good as developers to have that code coverage where all your functions are tested, like ultimately, like a lot of times that's not where either the bugs are being found, and it's really more to comfort the developers than it is to like ultimately help the users. And so as a result, rather than taking the traditional testing pyramid where you focus on unit tests first and then you focus on integration and then end-to-end, I actually think we should kind of flip it on its head a bit. And instead, I think it's actually important for us to focus on the end-to-end, because this is actually where we actually find out whether or not this actually delivers value to user first. And then certainly as we figure out bugs and we figure out where we need to add basically unit tests and those things to cover common scenarios, then we do that accordingly. But we start with our end-to-end tests. So looking back at our gigantic pile of mess that end-to-end typically is viewed as, let's kind of look back and sort of apply the Pareto principle accordingly. So as we mentioned, most teams avoid end-to-end tests because they take a long time and they're unreliable. And so what I've seen across a lot of teams is ultimately either one, they're not relying on their tests anymore. So you see like the build is continuously failing, but they're still deploying, AKA the tests aren't helpful. Or there are just no end-to-end tests at all. And because, again, we're trying to do everything, we end up like with nothing at all. And so that's not great, because we want to make sure our applications are robust so that we can iterate and release new features without being afraid that critical features don't go down. And so I have a thing I like to say, when it comes to tests in your application, I always try to make sure that in any application that I work with that you have two particular tests. One, you want to make sure, can the user log in? Two, can the user pay us? After that, everything's optional. And so as you can imagine, right, like logging out and all that, those are important things, but for most applications, this is the fundamental part of them having a business. Because without these two pieces, you're basically going to run out of revenue and none of your other tests are going to matter. And so when you thinking about it like that, now you don't have this whole slew of coverage where you're trying to get 100% coverage or whatnot. Again, we have two critical paths that you need to make sure, and then any other ones that you identify. And so rather than trying to test all the browsers, we all know we tend to get analytics as far as understanding where our users are coming from. So oftentimes for most of us, like this means we can actually ignore most of the browsers, and we can say at the bare minimum, let's make sure that we have Chrome. And then while it might be great to test all the different screen sizes, let's say we know that our application, for example, is primarily desktop users, then we can simply focus on testing desktop users on Chrome with our critical paths. And then and then also like, again, not to just only pitch Chrome, like in the event you have, most of your users on mobile and that they're using Firefox, for example, then you basically figure out your greatest impact for the least amount of effort. And there's a lot of wins with this because this means that not only are you spending less resources spinning up, virtual machines for every single environment, this means that it's cheaper resource-wise, and then your time iteration for building new features is so much faster because at least for most of the users, like your tests are actually passing and they can be relied on. And so when it comes to this, in the end-to-end testing world within Vue.js, there are three main tools that are basically recommended. There is Cypress, Test Cafe, and Nightwatch. So I don't personally have any experience with Nightwatch, but I can say that at the bare minimum, for Test Cafe and Cypress, I've heard really great things from the community as far as their usage of it. So as far as personal recommendations, these are the two that I would recommend checking out if you're looking into your end-to-end testing tool. Granted, personally, I've had the most experience with Cypress, so we're going to dive into a little bit of what an end-to-end testing experience is like using Cypress for our Vue app. And so with that, I hope you all are ready. Let's look at some code. Okay, so right here, what we have here is a standard Vue CLI scaffolded project. So it has Webpack and everything. And so one of the nice things about things like Cypress, Nightwatch, I think they're working on a Test Cafe plugin, is that we can use the Vue CLI to simply add Cypress by using vue add e to e Cypress, and it'll use the plugin to scaffold out everything that you would need for Cypress. All right. So let's open this up inside of VS Code. So what we see here is that there's this new directory inside. Let me blow this up a bit. Can people see the font okay? Let's see, I don't have the chat window open. Okay. Chris, if people can't see, let me know. So here we have our test folder. That's where everything is going to live. And you'll see that we were basically Vue CLI, as it usually does, did a nice job of scaffolding out some commands for us so that we can get everything started. So let's go ahead and run our test command. So test e to e. And so what this does is it starts our local development server as we would typically expect at port 8080. And then it goes one step further to open up Cypress. And so one thing that's slightly different about Cypress is rather than run in the command line like that, compared to what most of us are used to when it comes to tests, there's basically a whole application that helps us to manage and enhance our developer experience when it comes to testing. So let's go ahead and open up this scaffolded test.js that's basically been scaffolded for us. And so what you see here is that here we have basically a Chrome window that is actually controlled by Cypress. And so it gives us basically a first-class debugger experience. Here we can see that inside of our test, we are running visit app URL. And the first thing it does, it goes ahead and visits our root path. And then it simply verifies that our H1 exists and that it contains the welcome to your Vue.js app. And so you might be thinking like, okay, this is kind of interesting. Like what does the code actually look like? So let's go ahead and let's enhance our test.js here. And we're going to go ahead and go inside of our specs, inside of our test.js. Now, for those who are new to testing, tests basically break down to like form-wise into two blocks. You have your describe block, which basically groups tests together. So this would allow you to group things functionally speaking. So imagine if you wanted to like test like authentication, for example, you would group your tests inside of this block. And so every single test then is described by an it block. Like it does this. So we can say, for example, in our like, sort of faux test, it'd be like, it logs in the user successfully. So this would be one test here. We can say, it shows an error when wrong password. And so here is where we have like our basic testing structure right here and describe and it blocks. So mapping what we learned earlier, we can see here that we have our describe first test. And so let me actually reduce this down from full screen. So we can compare the two. So you can see here that, and then the visits the app URL is actually thrown here inside of our command log over here. And then the individual steps are reflected inside of our steps. And so what we're going to do here is going to add another test. And this time we're going to go ahead and visit the about page. And so I'll say it visits the about page. And so let me full screen this for now. And so what we want to do is we want to go ahead and visit the home page and then click on the about link. And so Cypress, one of the things it does that's a little bit different from things like Test Cafe is it tries to manage all of the events that happen inside of your tests in a synchronous, like it looks synchronous, but it manages all the async stuff in the back. So in other words, as you can imagine, when you go onto a web page, sometimes you have to wait for things to load. But a lot of times, one of the trickiest things when it comes to testing is that things don't, like the testing tool doesn't always wait for everything to load. And so as a result, this is where sometimes you get those false negatives where it can't find a link, for example, because it hasn't actually finished waiting for the page to load because for whatever instance, your database is taking just a fraction of a second longer and it times out on your testing tool. And so when it comes to end-to-end testing, you want your tool to be able to be good at managing those things without you having to think about it. And so, for example, we want to make sure that when we visit the home page, right, just like the relative root, we want to go ahead and let's just go ahead and get an anchor tag. And we're going to make sure that it contains the text about. And then all we're going to do is click it. And so from a readability perspective, this is fairly declarative. We're not talking about implementation details. We're making sure that we get an anchor element. It contains this text, and then we want to click it. And so once you start up your basically your end-to-end environment, you'll notice that when I save, it actually automatically reloads the page accordingly on the left-hand side, which means that as you're iterating through your tests, you actually can see it basically, you're basically getting hot module reloading with your tests as you're writing them, which is, as we all know, when it came to front-end development, that's like a huge boost for just the developer experience as a whole. And so now that we've clicked it, we might be like, okay, now let's check the H1, right? And so, let's say I didn't know any better, and I was like, well, I want to get the H1, and I think that it should, have the text of about page. Let's just say this is like what we expect. And so this syntax is a little bit new. So for those who haven't, again, written a lot of tests, these are called assertions, which basically allow you to check one thing versus another. So the should in Cypress particularly lets you check a specific thing. So in this case, we're checking for whether it has certain text. And then the second part is basically what it expects the text to be right here. So when we go ahead and save this, you'll see now that it'll actually go ahead and spin right here, because it'll tell you immediately that we expected H1 to have the text about page, but instead what we got was this is an about page. And so as you can imagine, when it comes to building things and trying to debug things, having clear error message is really critical. So one of the things that's important to me when it comes to evaluating tools is the ability to just quickly find out what's going on. And so the fact that we can immediately see what that assertion is and what's wrong is really important. So now that we know that, we can simply, again, if we wanted to, where did my thing go? Here we go. So now we can simply, again, if we know that we were the wrong ones, then we can simply switch this out to this is an about page. And it'll go ahead, and as we can see now, it passed really quickly. And so the other thing that you might have noticed when I was hovering is that this allows you to give basically, you're allowed to time travel through your tests, which is, I can't tell you how many times this has saved me when it comes to debugging things, because just like you would expect when you're managing state, when you're doing something as intricate as end-to-end testing, where you're talking to databases and waiting for API calls to happen, it really is important for you to be able to visit like basically a certain part of the page and be like, okay, so at this step, this is what the page looked like. When I clicked on it, this is the before, this is the after. Like, so again, pretty simple. And then, okay, so we got the H1, this is what it was, and this is like great. And so what you can do is you can actually like pin it too. So when I clicked on it, you'll see here that we can actually compare the before and after. And so this is huge when it comes to debugging. And this is one of the things I loved about Cypress, again, even prior to joining the company, is the fact that at the end of the day, like this is still just, this is a Chrome instance. So when it comes to debugging, you still have access to actually looking inside of your elements and actually visualizing like what's going on in here, rather than just getting simple images that you then have to like might load environment. Like you can see inside of the context, like what exactly happened. And so this will allow you to see things like network calls when you're making API calls and those sort of things. And it just, I can't begin to tell you, it's absolutely a wonderful experience. So here is sort of a straightforward example of how it could be used. And so I want to go ahead and spend a little bit of time showing you what it might be like in sort of a more production app. And so I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the real world app, and let's start this. Right. So in this application, this is one of the open source projects that Cypress created called the Real World app, where there is actually like a database that we like seed, and there's like a whole complex backend that basically talks to the front end. And so this thing is currently doing its thing. In the meantime, I'm gonna run the, actually this yarn test for this command. All right. All right, so here we have our real world app, and let me make sure that everything's great. Okay, so just to give you a quick tour, our real world app, basically this simulates payment apps, just like sort of if you might be familiar with Venmo or PayPal. So basically we can see here that you can actually check various things, and it'll, it has a lot of different things that you would expect from a production level app. So let's go ahead and open this up, and let's go ahead and, for example, let's verify that the bank accounts API is working correctly. And so, one of the things I kind of glossed over earlier is the chat of integration tests. And so this is one of those things where end-to-end tests, they kind of end up getting mixed up together as far as how you test them out. And so this is an example of where you can just simply test that the APIs are running correctly. So you can see here, we can actually see what the steps are happening. Because again, there's nothing happening at the UI layer, right? The user is not doing anything. But from an API perspective, we can test that, like, once we've seeded the database, let's go ahead and make a request to post to our 3001 login API endpoint. And then let's make sure that we assert that one, for example, it's a 200, and that we get the right hash. And so even though this is, again, not UI based, Cypress can be leveraged, and your end-to-end tool, to be honest, your end-to-end tool should be able to leverage, integration tests such as this if you just want to test the API piece. But again, as we talked about, a lot of the value ultimately comes from the UI piece. And so let's look into like bank accounts, for example. So in this particular spec, we're going to go ahead and have the user actually create a bank account. And so you can see there's a lot going on here. And to be honest, it's kind of, I don't know, we've had friends sort of go through this, and it's kind of therapeutic to just sit here and watch all your test runs. And so we can see here that inside of our create bank account, there is a whole slew of things going on as far as, like, again, once our database has been seeded, making sure that we're logging in to see how everything's going. We're waiting for API calls to fire off. And again, you can step through every step so that in the event you have any errors, you can actually see what's happening at every step, which again makes a huge difference. So, we're gonna run that through one more time. And so you can see it does a lot as far as like going through, checking, and you can make sure that if anything breaks, that everything's fine. As you can see, as far as we're concerned, all of our tests are running correctly. All right. Now, let's switch back. All right. So again, when it comes to testing, my goal here is not necessarily to convince anyone to use Cypress, because again, Cypress itself is an open source tool, 100% free. As a representative of the Vue core team, like for me, it's about helping to provide you with guidance as far as what tools make the most sense for your application. So again, I know that there are some members of the core team who prefer Test Cafe, for example. And so figuring out the limitation and constraints of each tool when it comes to testing is super important. And so, we try to document that on the new testing section docs. So if you go to the new docs, which is at v3.vue.js.org, there's a whole testing section in there to provide some more guidance regarding basically the frameworks that I've went over today, as well as sort of diving in a little bit more and providing some resources. And so again, at the end of the day, testing is a complicated thing, but the more you can focus on the critical paths and making sure that you deliver value to your user, and making it honestly just fun for your developers to write tests to begin with, because again, it's one of those things we often postpone and don't take time for. But when you have a development experience, like we saw in Cypress, where you basically have hot module reloading, you can interact with your tests and see what exactly is going on. It makes the testing experience just that much smoother. And to be honest, from the people that I've had start using end-to-end tests that have experiences like this, like they start looking forward to writing tests because they can actually see what's happening, which is why a lot of us really love web development to begin with, because there is that tangible feedback that we get as we write tests. So with that said, thank you everybody for joining today. I'm happy to go ahead and open up the floor for questions and Q&A.